There are some stories that just seize our attention right there. These cases of violent crime that seem to be everywhere in the headlines. And it's not just because they're tragic, but because they leave us all asking that same really unsettling question. Why?
Right. Why did this happen? What could possibly lead someone to do that?
Especially when the motive just seems, well, missing
Mm.
or incredibly confusing.
Mm-hmm. And that need to understand, to kind of find a narrative that makes sense of something senseless, that's just deeply human, isn't it?
It really is. Our minds just search for connections for reasons.
Trying to fill that gap.
Absolutely. And that impulse, that need to understand, that's exactly what we're diving into today. We're focusing on the Bryan Kohberger case. He was accused, you'll remember, of the November 2022 murders of 4 University of Idaho students.
A case that shocked everyone.
It really did.
Mm.
Now, let's be super clear right from the start. Our goal here isn't to, rehash all the crime details. Instead, we want to explore the broader, much more complex questions this case brings up about potential contributing factors.
Things that might play a role in the background.
And it's also important to mention he has actually entered a guilty plea now, which honestly adds another layer of complexity to how the public tries to understand his actions. Or maybe the lack of understanding.
Yeah, that definitely changes the landscape. It's cases like this, like Kohberger's, that really push us to look beyond just the immediate facts.
To consider those underlying aspects of human behavior that might be involved.
Exactly.
So for you, our listener, our mission in this deep dive is really to unpack some of these health-related factors, particularly mental health conditions. The kind of things criminologists and psychologists often study when they look at violent behavior.
But it's crucial to frame this correctly.
Yes, very crucial. We're talking about potential insights, theories, things researchers consider. Not confirmed diagnoses for Kohberger, and definitely not direct explanations for his actions. Because, well, no definitive motive has ever been publicly confirmed.
And we're basing this discussion on a specific article, Health Factors in Violent Crime, the Kohberger Case, which really digs into these very complex considerations.
It tries to navigate that tricky space between observation and actual diagnosis, trying to bring some clarity where there's often very little.
It's a nuanced area.
So think of this deep dive as like your shortcut to getting a more nuanced handle on these often misunderstood topics. We really want to move past the speculation and get into a more informed discussion. And hopefully, you'll walk away with some surprising facts, maybe a few aha moments.
Sounds good. Where should we start?
Okay, let's unpack this.
Right. So when we start talking about mental health and violent behavior, it's, I think, absolutely critical to begin with a fundamental point the article really stresses.
Goodness.
Mental health conditions are very, very rarely the sole cause of violent crime. It's just not that simple. And the vast majority, overwhelmingly, of individuals living with mental health disorders are not violent people.
That's such an essential baseline to establish, isn't it? Especially with these high-profile cases where speculation runs wild.
It really is.
And in Kohberger's specific situation, the public information about his actual health history is, well, incredibly limited.
Very limited.
What we've mostly seen are, like you said, speculative observations or maybe some anecdotal reports from people who knew him.
Mm-hmm.
How do we even begin to sort through that, given we have to stick to the rule? No confirmed diagnoses.
Yeah, that's exactly the challenge here. The article points to several conditions that researchers often study in relation to violent behavior, but it consistently emphasizes that we don't have confirmed diagnoses in this case. It's all about potential factors, not definite links.
Okay, so let's start with one that comes up often, Antisocial Personality Disorder, or ASPD. A lot of people probably associate that with aggression, but maybe for you, our listener, what does ASPD really mean clinically? And are there less obvious ways it might show up that criminologists look at?
That's a great question. Because yes, the hallmarks are things like a profound lack of empathy, a disregard for rules and social norms, maybe impulsive or manipulative behavior. But here's something often overlooked. Only a small percentage of people actually diagnosed with ASPD commit violent crimes.
Oh, interesting. So it really challenges that sort of pop culture idea that everyone with ASPD is automatically dangerous.
Exactly. It's a misconception. Individuals with ASPD might engage in criminal acts, maybe without remorse, but that statistical link to violence isn't nearly as direct as media often suggests.
So how does that relate even speculatively to Kohberger?
Well, with Kohberger, there were some anecdotal reports, describing him as maybe socially isolated or having a kind of cold stare. These are just observations, of course, but they are things that could align with some ASPD traits. But again, it's vital, absolutely vital, to stress these are just observations, not anything close to an official diagnosis.
Right, just observations. Okay. So if ASPD is one possible lens, what about those other traits people talk about, like psychopathy or narcissism? How do they fit into this kind of analysis? Especially in a case where maybe notoriety or this idea of pulling off a perfect crime is speculated about as a motive.
Yeah, that's where it gets really interesting, theoretically speaking. Psychopathy, often defined by that sort of emotional detachment and a deep need for control.
And narcissism.
Narcissism, characterized more by that inflated sense of superiority, maybe entitlement, both are sometimes linked in research to violent acts.
And the control aspect in psychopathy, is it always just about dominating people?
Not necessarily. That's a surprising insight sometimes. The desire for control can also manifest as this sort of perverse intellectual mastery, like treating situations, even horrific ones, as intricate puzzles to be solved. This can sometimes lead to highly organized, meticulously planned actions.
And with Kohberger, the speculation definitely picked up because of his background, right? A criminology PhD student.
Exactly. That, coupled with reports that he had a fascination with serial killers, really fueled theories. Theories about maybe wanting to orchestrate a perfect crime or perhaps gain some kind of dark notoriety.
But we have to keep saying it.
We do. These theories remain completely unproven. No psychological evaluation has ever been made public. It's all speculation based on circumstantial information.
Okay, let's shift to something where there's a bit more concrete, though still historical, insight. Depression, and suicidal ideation. The article mentions Kohberger's teenage posts online, I think on a site called Tapatalk.
Tapatalk.
And these apparently showed struggles with depression, dissociation, even suicidal thoughts back then. Plus, he also disclosed having used heroin during high school.
Yeah, those past experiences certainly seem to indicate some unresolved mental health challenges from his younger years. It's an important part of his history.
Definitely part of the background.
But, and this is critical, the article is very explicit with this caveat.
Okay.
There is absolutely no evidence suggesting active depression or substance use was linked to the murders themselves.
Right, so these are past struggles, maybe indicating vulnerability, but not necessarily active factors when the crime occurred.
Precisely. It's history, not necessarily current state at the time.
Then we get to claims made by his defense team. They've apparently brought up Autism Spectrum Disorder, OCD, and something called Developmental Coordination Disorder. They argued these conditions affect his social functioning and how he regulates emotions. Now, as you said, these aren't typically linked to violence.
Not at all.
So what's the defense strategy there, according to the article's analysis?
You're right. These disorders are generally not associated with violence. The defense's angle, it seems, was to suggest that these conditions could create an unconscionable risk of his actions being misinterpreted.
Misinterpreted how? Like during the police investigation or in court, maybe?
Possibly. That seems to be the implication. But the article is very clear. No evidence directly ties these specific conditions to the crime itself. These claims appear to be part of a legal strategy rather than confirmed medical facts explaining the alleged acts.
Okay, that makes sense in terms of legal maneuvering. Let's circle back slightly to substance use. The article mentions his reported heroin addiction when he was younger. Even if he wasn't actively using at the time of the murders, can long-term addiction still have lingering effects that criminologists might consider?
That's a really important distinction to make. So while there's zero indication of active substance use around the time of the murders,
Right.
the long-term effects of serious addiction can, in some individuals, potentially impact things like brain function, impulse control, maybe emotional stability down the line.
So it's a general possibility, not specific evidence in this case.
Exactly. It's a general observation from research about potential neurological consequences of addiction. It's part of the broader, complex picture of factors that could be relevant in some cases, but not a direct link established here.
Got it. And of course, you can't have a case like this without the internet going wild with theories. The article briefly touches on some online speculation, I think mainly on platforms like X. Things like sleepwalking or hallucinations from insomnia, even undiagnosed psychotic disorders.
And it's absolutely crucial to state, just as the article does, very firmly, these theories completely lack credible evidence. Full stop.
Right. No basis, in fact.
None. They aren't supported by any court documents, any official reports. It's really a stark reminder that, not everything you read online, especially in comment sections, is grounded in reality.
A very important reminder. So taking all this in, or maybe the lack of concrete information, how does it all tie back to that big question of motive? The article keeps circling back to this core idea. Mental health conditions, on their own, don't cause violent crime.
They don't. And most people with these disorders are not violent.
So the conditions themselves aren't the why.
Exactly. And when you connect this to the wider body of criminological research, it usually points towards a really complex interplay of factors. Things like maybe social rejection, feelings of isolation, perhaps a deep-seated need for control, rather than just a single health issue driving the behavior. It's rarely just one thing.
Right. It's almost always a combination of sort of perfect storm of factors.
Often, yes.
And in Kohberger's specific case, there are naturally these speculative hypotheses about his motives. They range from personal grievances, like maybe rejection by women, to this kind of academic obsession with crime itself.
Yeah, the criminology student angle definitely fuels that line of thought.
Right. Was he maybe driven by a desire to test his knowledge, prove his intelligence somehow, almost like treating it as a grotesque academic exercise?
Those are some of the theories floated, yes. But again, purely speculative. And the article makes a really compelling distinction here between the evidence and the motive. Well, the evidence against Kohberger, the DNA, the cell phone data, surveillance footage, that stuff establishes his presence at the crime scene. It helps establish what happened and potentially who was involved.
But now why?
Exactly. It doesn't clarify why he might have acted. That fundamental question remains separate from the physical evidence trail.
And ultimately, now with his guilty plea, the public might actually never get a detailed explanation of his motives from him.
That's highly likely now.
That crucial why could just remain a mystery forever, leaving us with far more questions than answers.
Indeed. And cases like Kohberger's, they truly underscore the profound complexity, trying to understand the violent acts, the multifaceted nature of human behavior, especially when you start considering potential health factors.
Yeah.
It just highlights how absolutely vital it is to distinguish between speculation, however tempting, and actual confirmed evidence.
It really does. This whole deep dive, I think, really shows that ongoing challenge in criminology and psychology, too, trying to bridge that huge gap between the behavior we can observe and the deep internal drivers behind it.
It's a constant puzzle, often an elusive one.
Yeah,
and maybe that leaves an important question for you, our listener, to sort of ponder on your own. In cases like this one, like Kohberger's, where the why might genuinely never be fully revealed, how do we as a society, how do we grapple with that profound uncertainty, and our own inherent need for explanations, for closure?
That's a heavy question.
It is. And it's a question that tends to echo long after the headlines fade away.